response to that. We are disaggregating data and really focusing on the context in which these disparities exist over time, and then thinking about policies to dismantle structural racism in our economy and in our society. And all of that really has a lot, or the community development program in particular has a lot of responsibility for this work. So we have for years made economic mobility and resilience our platform within the community development program around the system, but especially in the Atlanta community development program. And I put the hashtag everyone's economy, which I know, Velma, you helpfully also added to the invite. And this is, shorthand for how we're thinking about this. The economy isn't working or hasn't been working for everybody. How do we think about, especially in this moment, not returning to the status quo, but returning to a more inclusive economy that works for everyone? And so I'll move on to kind of talking about the community development program at the Atlanta Fed. Like many of the other community development programs, again, we're very independent, but we all have generally a mission to advance community development goals within our own districts. And so that means focusing on low and moderate income communities, communities of color, and other kind of disinvested and disadvantaged communities. In Atlanta, we do this in a number of ways. So we definitely are out there. Before COVID, we were out in the field. Now we're doing this, of course, remotely from our desks, but tracking and elevating issues that are emerging or persistent within our districts. During COVID, there's been a huge number of new types of issues that have arisen, of course. And then we're responding to that partly with our research department or our research portion of our unit by conducting evidence-based research, to building tools to help communities understand trends and needs. And then we basically take that information and activate it or bring it back to the stakeholders, bring it back to communities. And we work in partnership with local governments, community-based organizations, funders like banks and philanthropy, and many others to set the table for creating these partnerships, but often actually working at the table with them. And so there's a few kind of domains in which we tend to focus our expertise in Atlanta: community development finance, economic development and small business, housing and neighborhoods, and workforce development are the main four. We've also added another set of expertise around what we're calling shocks and stresses, which is actually something that we recruited for prior to the pandemic, but has even more relevance now. But really thinking about how things like natural disasters, recessions, impact low and moderate income populations more greatly, and those communities have a tendency to recover more slowly. Again, just as an illustration of how we do this work, you can kind of see that prior to COVID, we were convening partners very frequently to build awareness, to work hand in hand on advancing solutions. We have a number of tools and reports, which I'll actually talk a little bit more about throughout this presentation. But these are, again, examples of kind of visual examples of how we do this work and the activities that we generally engage in. So I wanted to pivot and talk a little bit more about COVID and how our response unfolded. So, like many of you, early March, we immediately went to a remote work stance. So as I mentioned, we used to be out in the field a lot. We traveled across our 6 states to talk to and work with and give presentations and convene partners. And during that first week, we just picked up the phone and called a lot of those same partners and stakeholders to understand what was going on and what they saw as the biggest needs on the horizon, kind of the extent of the disruption in their work. And these were things like direct service providers, community-based organizations, and others. And again, I just mentioned this, but shocks and stresses really do tend to have a greater impact on the low and moderate income and communities of color populations. We saw from things like the Great Recession and previous natural disasters that these communities can take much longer to rebound. Places are still recovering. We still have pockets of disinvestment post-recession, post-last recession. And then how do we think now, moving into hopefully a recovery period soon, how do we think about, again, a recovery that doesn't just reinscribe those previous inequities and inequalities, but is more inclusive and we target our resources towards those with the most need to make sure that, again, the economy is working for everyone, and we're building back better, to coin or to borrow a phrase. And I just wanted to show as an example this map of deaths per 100,000 people. You can see in our district, there's some pockets of deep disparities of greater levels of infections and deaths, and that has a lot to do with the underlying conditions, with the social vulnerability, et cetera. So we in our district, we feel that this is going to be again something that's hitting us hard, and it's probably going to take us longer to rebound given where we started. So within the community development program, I can speak to the bank had a number of different responses. You may know that the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, stood up a number of lending facilities, dropped interest rates. But within the community development program, we immediately knew that there were a few things that we wanted to track that were pivoting from our original work plans for 2020, but were really critical. And some of that is just thinking about the workforce. And we saw unemployment claims skyrocketing. So I'll show you a tool that we stood up that really tracks those real time, or at least every week. And then evictions was another big issue that we were hearing from our stakeholders. Despite the fact that there are moratoria in place, there still are evictions occurring for various reasons, partly from enforcement, but partly because there are kind of loopholes or ways that landlords can evict, despite the fact that there's a moratoria. We also looked at things like childcare needs, which was one of the major barriers for folks to get back to work, impacts on small businesses, which have been enormous. And we have a foreclosure resource center that we developed for the past recession that we updated with things like COVID-related forbearance programs and other resources specific to this recession and public health crisis. And then another thing that I won't get into as much today because it's very nascent is a new initiative that we're calling an Inclusive and Resilient Recovery Action Lab. And so we've developed a series of webinars. A couple of them have already occurred, and we're rolling out more that bring in experts to talk about, this notion of how do we build back better in terms of things like small business, housing, community development, finance. But this will also include a more immersive program for a number of leaders across our district to build capacity and help them to understand and learn from one another in a kind of a peer learning network about better resilience and more inclusive recovery strategies. So I'm now going to talk about a few types of products and tools that might be of interest to you all. And I'll try and run through these quickly. I'm going to try and be a little more cognizant of time, but I've put some links in here, so you're free to go back and check them out in more depth if anything is of interest. But one of the first things I wanted to talk about was how we started to build basically how we started to collect intelligence about what was going on early in the pandemic. And it became a system-wide survey that was deployed across the nation, and it's called the Perspectives from Main Street survey. It is a survey basically of intermediaries, so again, direct service providers, community-based organizations, local governments, and some other actors who work in the community development space. It was deployed 4 times, basically every 8 weeks. The most recent data are from October, and there may be another survey rolling out in early 2021. And it measures a lot of things that our colleagues on the research side or on the research economist side are collecting about businesses and firms. So, what is the level of disruption, the expected duration of until their recovery actually is complete, and then changes to their capacity due to COVID. And I'll just show you a brief or a quick slide that illustrates some of the types of impacts that we were measuring. And these are actually impacts on the organizations themselves, as well as the people and the communities that they serve. So we are able to see in October that most of the dimensions that we were looking at actually were still getting moderately worse. A couple things, there was relatively no change, but things like education, health, income loss, we still saw negative downturns in those areas. So another another tool that I actually mentioned a moment ago is our unemployment insurance claims monitor. And this is something that we developed almost immediately, understanding that not only are the unemployment claims a great indicator before the monthly unemployment numbers come out of kind of what's going on, what sectors are most impacted. We can also actually disaggregate this data by race and age and gender. And so basically the tool allows you to do just that. You can look over time. You can also, it also includes things like the extended unemployment insurance and the pandemic unemployment assistance, which was available and still I think is available to contract workers. Another feature is that you can kind of scroll over or hover over some of these data points and see, for example, what share of the workforce um, is actually, like, for example, if you pick a certain race, what share of the workforce is in that race compared to what share of the unemployment claims are of people of that race. So you can kind of see where there's disproportionate impacts on particularly women and communities of color and certain industry sectors like hospitality, for example. So it's a very interactive tool and encourage you to check it out if you're interested. Another tool that we have that I'll just kind of briefly talk about because this is something less related to COVID, but perhaps interesting for folks on the call is our Opportunity Occupations Monitor. And this is a tool that actually looks at and helps communities identify at the metro level what jobs are available that pay a median wage, but don't require a bachelor's degree or higher. And these data are actually also being rolled into some forthcoming work, which is looking at transitions in the workplace. So we're able to see job postings using some of the background data here, and to think about how folks from some of those most impact industries can eventually transition and be reskilled or upskilled into more in-demand and higher paying or more lucrative sectors. So this is the Opportunity Occupations Monitor. And then another kind of related thread of work is thinking about job training and skilling, reskilling, and how disincentives actually exist in the system due to public assistance programs and what we call benefits cliffs. So if you think about an individual who maybe has a childcare benefit or a housing voucher and is offered a higher paying job, a small raise, or even a number of additional overtime hours, they might turn that down actually, or they might turn down a path to another highly more skilled job because they're going to lose that very important and beneficial and valuable assistance. And so this project allows, and we have a number of tools that kind of break this down by career paths and locations, metro areas. So you can see in this example how someone who's working in a low wage job, of kind of minimum wage job, might be disincentivized to actually work towards something like an LPN and a nursing track because of what you see at the beginning of these graphs, those dips in their compensation due to the loss of benefits. And so these are data that are being used right now by a number of state and local kind of decision makers to think about how to better align our safety net programs and our job training and workforce programs. So that's our Advancing Careers body of work. And there's more to it, but I just wanted to quickly touch on that tool in particular. And then we have a couple of tools that are related to housing I'd like to just touch on. And one is a rental affordability tracker. We're actually about to update this with brand new data. Right now, it's a couple years outdated, but essentially this allows you to see for the rental population, what percentage of folks within a certain region or state are paying more than 30% of their income on housing, which is what we consider too much or what we consider a cost burden household. This also allows you to see relative shortages or in some cases small surpluses of rental units at various categories of income. Again, this will be updated soon and this has really been used mainly by some of the sort of state and local governments or housing advocates to understand what the needs are and to then make the case for more resources to develop affordable housing, especially at some of those lower income categories. And then another one that's another tool related to housing that's much more kind of pertinent to the COVID impacts is a eviction tracker that we have currently developed for the Atlanta metro area, but we're hoping to expand this into some other areas soon. And this is in partnership with the Atlanta Regional Commission and Georgia Tech School of City and Regional Planning. And this has been interesting. This is a screenshot of like the map tool that we have, so you can see where hotspots of evictions are taking place. This is data from August, but at the bottom you can see you can also look at the differences between what the blue line is 2019 eviction filings, and the red bars are the 2020 numbers. So you can see where there are differences. That definitely there was a moment during the early part of the pandemic where there's moratoria were actually helping to keep people in place, keep people in stable housing. But as time has wore on, we have seen upticks in evictions that are quite troubling given the public health crisis and the lack of or the unemployment numbers that we see in this region. And then just a couple other things that I'll go through more quickly. We have some uh, reporting or data on small businesses that might be of interest. And all 12 banks are actually part of what we call our small business credit survey, which is a national survey focused on really the credit needs of small businesses, as well as where folks are applying for credit, or other types of funding that they're using, and how sort of satisfied they are with those types of funding, among other questions. And these data can be broken out by demographics, by region or state. There's a lot of rich information. And the most recent report using these data is coming out in February, and we'll have more. I think there's a module actually that went out in the fall to look at specific COVID-related impacts on small businesses. And this website has a number of reports looking at different specific types of businesses. There's one on natural disasters. There's quite a lot of information on the Small Business Credit Survey website. And then I'll just kind of talk or touch briefly on the fact that we do have on our website a number of publications that I didn't talk about that you might be interested in. Some are quite focused or specific to certain topics. Like there's one on heirs property that's actually pictured here, which is a topic related to housing and wealth and asset building. Some are quite broad on workforce development, investments, and policies. But this is a link to see the sorts of working papers, volumes, books, and on our blogs that we publish under the Partners Update brand. And then we also, even though we're not convening in person, we, like many others, are hosting a lot of webinars. A couple ones to highlight are Ask Us Anything, which is actually on hiatus, but we'll be back soon. And that one is related specifically to our workforce development body of work through our Center for Workforce and Economic Opportunity. And they've had a lot of great experts on. They really do answer all the questions that come in, so you can ask them anything. And they tend to be on specific topics as well. I'd like one on, I believe, on race, one recently on the future of work, et cetera. We have a system-wide series called Connecting Communities, which are webinars that also cover a broad range of community development topics. The next one actually is in February and will be focused on that small business credit survey results. And then last, the Racism in the Economy series. This is a new series that was launched last fall. The next iteration will be March 1st and will be focused on housing. And this is also all 12 banks are participating, and we've had some really incredible speakers. And it's been very focused on transformative ideas to address racism in the economy, as well as awareness of some of the underlying causes and root causes of how racism has impacted certain aspects of the economy. And so I think that's it. These are just a few kind of points of contact where you can subscribe, you can follow us, you can email me directly. And I just wanted to throw the map back up there. If you happen to not be in the Georgia area or in the Southeast, you may want to reach out to a different reserve bank for, based on where you sit. And they also have community development programs that put out great work if you're curious. So thank you very much. I think we're ready for Q&A, Velma.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna start with Bill's question, and then I have a couple of questions as well, and I'm sure others too. So I think Bill's question is, with the eviction moratorium, what support is there for landlords? A large percentage of landlords are small businesses and cannot afford to cover the rent costs. Some are going out of business, and and through their life savings to cover these costs.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is a serious issue, and one that we did do a little bit of kind of qualitative work trying to understand within our districts some of the specific concerns. So some landlords who have federally backed mortgages are able to get forbearance, but that doesn't cover certainly the whole ecosystem of landlords. And in like CARES, as well as the newest package, Hero, is it called Hero still? There is some emergency rental assistance that's been allocated, but it's far less than what is needed. I think it's like 25 million, and some of the estimates are closer to 1 billion in rent debt that is outstanding. So yes, I agree, more needs to be done to address that, just that specific issue, and maybe to think about designing these programs to provide the assistance more directly to the landlords. However, then there's the sort of risk that you know they would need to keep their tenants in place, and how do you enforce that?
Bill, do you have a follow-up on that question? And you're muted. Can you unmute?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I know personally people that, have a couple small offices they own, and that was a main source of their income. And they have basically gone through their life savings trying to, and the federal government's not giving them any support, but they're telling the tenants they don't have to pay. So it's a tough situation that needs to be looked at. It's not a one-sided story when it comes to eviction.
Yeah.
Some people are and I'll admit we've been blessed as a small business owner who also owns our building. We have an SBA loan, so we didn't have to pay rent I'd say we didn't have to pay rent. We didn't have to make payments for 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
But your payments are like half the cost of what it takes to be a landlord. So it's not really working.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that we've heard that as well. Even if folks are in forbearance, they still are accruing, like you said, enormous costs. That's not often the main expense. Yeah.
I have another question, and I don't know if there are programs that you guys have in this particular area, but maybe you can elaborate on it just a little bit. I am part of a group that is studying what we call spatial inequalities, and it's a number of issues that probably are driven by zip code lotteries. So sort of similar to what Raj Chatty was doing in his research, right? Nowhere near that fancy, but some of the researchers in that specific group have talked about the need to understand digital divide a little more, especially post-pandemic. And I know that there are programs and monies to bring broadband access to rural areas in particular. But I think the researchers that I attended a symposium with just yesterday were talking about a couple of other things that go along with just access. One of them being the hardware, of course, and then the other one, information and literacy. And while maybe fintech can be there to replace some of the access to health, so say developing a telehealth options and other similar opportunities, what has been done to, or are there any programs you are aware of that maybe focus on tech literacy, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, that's so true. our Dallas Fed colleagues have done, and actually Kansas City too, have done more work on this and have some reports that I can share with you, Velma. But they
Okay.
always say it's the three-legged stool. It's broadband access, it's literacy, and it's the hardware. So yeah, are there programs that I could point you to? Yeah, I'd have to kind of go back. So we did a minor kind of like set of, or minor thrust of, or initiative on holding meetings with banks. This was before the pandemic, so it would have been 2019, I think, because there is, under the Community Reinvestment Act, which is a piece of legislation that the Fed is responsible in part for regulating. Banks are required to make investments in the places where they take deposits, so low income, underserved communities, including rural areas. And so there was a push to get banks involved to help to support mainly the infrastructure piece, but certainly all three legs of the stool, if you will. So, the OCC has also been, the Office of the Comptroller, another regulator, has been pushing this as well. In Atlanta, we did see some traction in some of our states. Actually, Georgia has a pretty active, at least there's momentum, I would say, at the state level, from the governor's office and others to work to provide some assistance or funding for this. And then the USDA has their Reconnect program. And I can point you to a couple contacts, I would say, that can maybe tell you more about that, Vilma.
Okay, that would be great. Follow up to that, I think what was brought up is, I believe you refer to it as small businesses, so kind of disappearance of the main street venues and social gathering places as well. And so I think there was a lot of talk about social interactions and information sharing through these informal networks. And are there any studies or research done on, say, possibly an equal effect of these factor in particular?
Yeah, well, to be honest, like my dissertation work was on something similar, looking at post Katrina, Mississippi, and some of the actually physical spaces that support social networks. And those were things like, I don't know, like libraries and schools and bowling alleys, restaurants,
Churches or
but also parks and like monuments, things that have sort of historic, meaning to them. And it was one of the, in my quantitative study, and it was a mixed method. So the interviews I did, it did come to light as a major factor for, especially areas where their downtown was heavily impacted. It was a major factor in bringing people back, and feeling connected to their community. So I don't, don't want to be too self-promoting, but I mean, there's a number of studies that I looked to when I was developing that and designing that study. So yes, so I agree. I think, and certainly like in rural areas where there's been these declines in kind of the small business sector for years, I don't know what's going to happen next with the pandemic. It's had such a severe impact.
I have a couple of questions from others in the audience. And Dina, would you like to ask your question or should I just read it?
I can ask them, I guess.
Yeah, it's a small group, so I would like to encourage conversation.
Yeah. So Anne, my first question had to do with women in the workplace. And, as we've seen, or at least as I've heard, I'm curious about the data to back it, because it sounds like you've looked at that data, is women being impacted across races more heavily in terms of unemployment, assuming that's due to childcare and remote schooling. Yeah. And so I'm curious if that's true, if that is what you're seeing, and if you all have had conversations on the impact of that on female mobility, upward mobility in the workplace after COVID.
Yeah, Deanna, I mean, great question. So women in the workplace, I would say I would point to a resource that I'll email this out to everybody, but the St. Louis Fed has done a lot of work on what they're calling the She Session. And it's so different than normal recessionary periods where actually we see male unemployment spike rather than female. And for the reasons you're saying, like the childcare issue, having children, remote learning, the sectors that were impacted also are kind of female dominant. And then, yeah, as far as like what to expect or what we're sort of forecasting moving forward, it's hard to say. I mean, there's always a risk of, labor force attachment that could decline, especially among women after years of, it actually increasing labor force participation women. Yeah, I mean, I would point you to the St. Louis work. I think that's probably of the work I know the most kind of comprehensive, but I think you're spot on, and it's kind of too soon to tell what the long-term impacts will be, but people are concerned.
Thank you.
All right. And did you have a follow-up question about the way surveys are conducted as well?
Yeah, this is probably a little selfish, but I thought it was interesting that you guys have done so many surveys throughout the pandemic. And, during non-pandemic times, we've had the opportunities when we're doing surveys to go out into the community and, even knock on doors. But it's a little more challenging. So I'm kind of curious what techniques you all are using to get to people beyond sending it out via technology.
Yeah, I would say mostly we're using convenience samples based on our lists of contacts across, and in many cases across all 12 banks. There is then a process to weight that data or weight those respondents to make it more representative of the United States. But yeah, we don't, well, with some exceptions, we do have a survey center that is able to do more of a random, like telephone number based sample. But for the ones I talked about today, that's not the case. The small business survey, though, will, I think eventually for next year, we'll be partnering with the census. So the census has its own business, I can't remember what they call it, census of businesses or something like that, that they're going to, we're going to be able to use their capabilities to do this, like basically in a randomized sampling kind of technique. So yeah, but for the most part, these are convenience samples right now.
Thank you.
All right, Bill, I think the next question in the chat box is yours. So would you like to?
Yeah, it's probably 3 questions bundled. I mean, it's probably better that I talk through them. One is we do a lot of planning studies and that help communities figure out how to redevelop. And it hasn't ceased to amaze me. The demand for rental housing continues to be pretty high. And now we're seeing a trend, emerging trend for more home ownership. And I'm just looking at those 2 things, and about a third of the way through the book Color of Law, and trying to, a lot of the communities we're helping have a large African American population that was left behind in the home equity work, and because of federal policy, actually, when you read that book. So what is being done? So I mean, I guess the big question is what is being done? How can we help these communities? What can we tell them that's available to help move that population into an equity position? We've got some tricks up our sleeves. We're partnering with cities that own the land and can put the land into the deal to get homeowners that used to live there or people that were there when they were a child come back. But so that's probably the biggest question. And then the second question, the first question was really, it just amazed me, like whole neighborhoods are being bought out for rental reasons, right? There's such a rental demand. We work with a lot of local elected officials. They don't want any more rental property. It's happening. People just buy up all the homes and rent them out. So What's going on there? So that's two or three questions. You pick them in any order you want.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly which types of neighborhoods you're talking about with the buying out of rental properties, but we have seen a lot of cash buyers, investors, speculators, if you will, crowding out, legacy residents who, if there was financing for those kind of small dollar mortgages, they would have the opportunity to buy and build equity. But that's one problem, I think, in some neighborhoods. But yeah, the solutions, this is interesting because we're actually doing this event on racism in the economy with a focus on housing. And a lot of what we're talking about is similar, redlining and other segregation and discriminatory practices have led to not like a devaluation of Black and Brown communities, but also this incredible increase in value in white communities that have benefited from this segregation. And so how do we reverse that? It's incredibly complicated. And even like things like appraisals have this sort of discrimination built into them through the use of comparatives or the comps when you're valuing the property. So we are talking about solutions. We have had very robust debates about this. There are people who think shared equity models, community land trusts, that sort of thing, can help preserve not only the affordability, but also the community and build equity. There are others who think that's a lesser than solution. We want home ownership. And then, on the home ownership side, of course, I think more resources to help with down payment assistance, to help with sort of financing those small dollar mortgages that currently banks are not willing to take the risk on. Well, it's not even the risk, it's actually, they say the transaction costs in some cases. So there's no silver bullet, unfortunately, Bill, but I think that there's a lot of structural problems that need to be dealt with, and then these sort of individual, or not individual, but more retail solutions that can help. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But is that partly, did I answer at least part of those questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it's a brain teaser. So I think a lot of people are thinking about it right now. And
Yeah, and I mean, you're
there are
right that,
good case studies, and maybe it's
yeah.
it's like a cottage industry to try and figure out how to resolve this, and we need to get the case studies out there.
Yeah, agreed. And I think like it's also important to point out that while the federal government, supported and condoned and codified redlining, it's still remnants of those systems really still exist today through the real estate and finance industries, in the way that we price risk, and the way that we, again, price the value of properties, et cetera. So yeah, I mean, there's always been a private sector role, but redlining didn't just eliminate some of those structural issues that are still in place.
I think I have one more question, if that's all right. And I know that there are a lot of anecdotal evidence and stories about this movement across the country driven by remote work policies, and many younger children, I don't know if they're younger children, younger adults moving back with their parents to maybe save on rents and things like that, and during the pandemic time. Do you guys expect that this trend of remote work will continue? For how long? Will we ever go back to normal, in quotation marks, that normal? And what are do you guys have any predictions on that behavior?
Wow, I wish I did. It's something I've thought about a lot, coming from a pretty small town, and I spent a couple months up there in Michigan during this pandemic. I did think a lot about like who's back, who is inhabiting this city now, and is it could it have like benefits for that community, and other like rural and small town areas across the country. We're definitely, you're probably aware that places in California, Silicon Valley are losing population because of the cost of living. But yeah, I don't know that I have the expertise to make a call on whether or not this is a long lasting trend, or just something that's going to last throughout the pandemic. But it's a great question. And I think has a lot of implications for places like the Southeast, where the cost of living is relatively low.
Yeah. And again, it was a personal, selfish question, the other one that you heard before, right? But again, my son came back from California and was staying home. He has intentions to go back, but his intentions are also to go back and maybe go into home ownership with the savings that he will have had from being there during the pandemic. But sometimes I wonder whether his company is even going to require them to come back, since he can do just as fine working remotely. So, well, that is all for me. I want to ask visitors if they have any other questions, and if Bill wants to say any other final concluding remarks. And with such a small meeting, we can probably finish a little earlier.
Yeah. If there's no other questions, I want to thank Ann for joining us, and consider becoming part of LAI, and talk a little bit about what's next. We have a year programmed out, and I've been working on the next program, which is going to be in March, and it's going to be about zero carbon development. I have a guest speaker from London who is an expert in doing mass timber high rises and mid rises. Andrew, we've been collaborating with him on a few things, and then a good friend of mine from Georgia Tech, now at the Georgia, not the Piedmont Conservancy, Howard Wertheimer, whose pet project while he's in his final days at Tech was the Candida building, is going to be a guest speaker, and we're looking for one more on community planning for zero carbon. So I think that's going to be a really kind of interesting discussion in land economics, but responsible land economics going forward. That'll be March 18th tentatively. So put that on the calendar if you're interested. In June, we're going to have Philip, who's our board member that is an expert in affordable housing, has done some on the West Side recently, but his family's been doing it for 3 generations all up and down the coast. He's going to put together a panel on affordable housing in August. We're going to try and catch the Braves game. and then hopefully in October, we'll have a session where we could do a tour. Last October, we did a virtual tour of the new library, main library downtown that one of our members was a contractor for. And that was a really good session, but it'll be great to meet face to face and actually tour a project. So we're looking for, we're hoping on the vaccine and October being a good time, and we're looking for a good project for us to all get face to face and go see. But that's all I've got, and I appreciate Ann coming and you finding Ann for this. It was great, and I'm glad we can end a little early. It seems like we're all busier with Zoom. We can actually cram in more meetings. We don't have to drive to meetings, and so I think we're actually all getting more productive and burned out at the same time. But anyways, so I don't think anybody would object to finishing up early. Did I hear any objections?